I had everything one should have. Success, closeness, recognition, but I myself wasn't there. And when you're missing from yourself, nothing is enough. Nothing satisfies. Nothing makes sense. This audiobook doesn't want to soothe you. It wants to shake you awake. It shows you what happens when you stop meeting expectations and finally begin to take yourself seriously. No empty motivational slogans, no sugarcoating, but an honest invitation back to you. Because sooner or later the moment arrives you've long been sensing you're missing. But most of all, you're missing from yourself. Chapter 1. When I realized that living for others doesn't work. It wasn't a clear moment, no sudden epiphany, no dramatic music in the background, no glowing sentence appearing like a miracle on the bathroom mirror once the steam cleared. None of that. It was more like gradual wear, a sort of inner static that began as a faint unease, hard to pinpoint, but you felt it. It lingered, grew louder, became heavier. Not so heavy that I stopped in my tracks, but enough to make everything feel a bit foreign, as if I were living my days at a distance, as if I was there, but not really. And for a while I ignored it. Because at first you can't name what's bothering you. You have your daily life, your appointments, your routines. It's running. You have people around you who like you. You have plans, goals, obligations. On paper, everything is good. And that's the most dangerous trap. When everything looks fine, but none of it feels truly alive. That's when things started to tip. There was no big bang, no breakup, no radical upheaval. It was subtler. Another kind of exhaustion. A tiredness you can't cure with sleep or a vacation. It felt as if I was slowly slipping out of myself. I had adapted so much, carried so much, functioned so hard that at some point I no longer knew whether I was acting of my own free will or just keeping pace because that's how everything was set up. And once you see that, there's no going back. Someone once told me, the soul gets sick when you stop listening to yourself. Back then I didn't understand the sentence. Today I carry it like a key within me. Because that is exactly what happened to me. I made myself sick through all my thoughtfulness. I overloaded myself with expectations, with roles, with things I never truly wanted but had learned to fulfill so as not to disappoint anyone. To belong. To be liked. As a child you learn, be good, don't cause trouble, be polite, think of others. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with being empathetic, considerate, supportive. But nobody tells you that you must not lose yourself in the process, that there's a point where you're no longer acting for others, you're sacrificing yourself for them. And this often happens quietly, step by step, until suddenly you feel you've taken a wrong turn without noticing. I didn't have the courage to change everything overnight. But I began to ask questions, uncomfortable questions. I noticed that in certain conversations I felt empty, in some groups out of place, that I made decisions to avoid hurting others, but moved further away from myself in the process. And that hurts, because you have to admit you spent a long time living against yourself, that you went along with many things that weren't yours, that you often made yourself small so as not to stand out. But change isn't easy when you believe you have so much to lose. Being there for others gives you a place. It makes you needed, reliable, pleasant. When you step out of that role, it feels wrong. Selfish. You begin to say no. You pull back. You speak more openly. And that creates tension. Not just with others, especially with yourself. No one prepares you for the guilt that arises when you start taking yourself seriously. You look in the mirror and no longer know whether you recognize yourself or have just grown used to the reflection. You realize that you're functioning in a life that isn't yours, that you're following a plan someone else designed, that you're chasing goals that don't fulfill you. And the worst part is, you did it well. You functioned. You were reliable, successful, kind. But precisely that success drove you away from yourself. The price is high. You feel nowhere truly at home. Not in your body, not in your relationships, not in your own life. The hardest thing wasn't letting people go or changing circumstances. The hardest thing was forgiving myself for having remained silent so often, for always putting myself last, for saying yes when my entire being screamed no, for having learned to ignore my discomfort. Living for myself wasn't an act of rebellion. It was an act of survival. I didn't do it because I was strong. I did it because I had no other choice. I was tired, empty, alien in my own routine. And not because I was sad, but because I simply wasn't present anymore. I was everywhere, just not with myself. Living for yourself doesn't mean being selfish. It doesn't mean closing off or ignoring the world. It means no longer constantly betraying yourself. It means, with every decision, no longer automatically asking, what will others think? But, what do I really want? It was uncomfortable. It hurt. Because if you've spent your entire life living for others, self-respect at first feels like betrayal. But then comes another kind of peace. Not a superficial well-being, a peace that runs deep. One that says, now I am here. Now I am real. And once you reach that point, there's no going back. Chapter 2. The mask that was hardest for me to wear. The mask of happiness. It wasn't the loudest mask, not the most obvious. It was quiet, elegant, well integrated, almost admired. And that's exactly why it was so dangerous. Because it didn't look like a mask. It looked like my real face. I was the one who always laughed, who seemed strong, who functioned. I was the one who never complained, who always had a quip ready, who downplayed problems, who always saw the positive. I was the person people liked to spend time with because I seemed so easygoing. I was the rock in the storm, the encourager, the optimist. And for a long time I believed that this was just who I was, that I was simply like that. Until I realized that it was exhausting. Not life itself, but that smile, that constant self-control, that inner censorship that immediately swallowed any feeling that didn't fit the image. I understood that I wasn't a positive person. I was someone who was afraid of burdening others. I was someone who had learned that it's dangerous to honestly show when you're not okay. I was someone who believed that you're only loved when you're pleasant. And that insight shook me. Because it meant I had cheated myself for years. Not out of malice, not out of vanity, but out of a deep need for acceptance. I had trained myself not to be sad. I'd forbidden myself to feel anger. I'd convinced myself that dwelling on pain was pointless. I was so focused on appearing strong and stable that I'd forgotten what it feels like to simply be honest. The mask of happiness is insidious. It gives you recognition, makes you popular, shields you from uncomfortable conversations. No one asks follow-up questions when you say everything's fine. No one probes when you smile and shake your head. You quickly become the favorite, the safe choice, the one who is always in a good mood. And at some point you realize there's no room left for anything else, that your surroundings don't even consider that you might not be okay. And then it gets tight, inside. Because there is sadness in there, frustration, fear, questions, doubts, things you don't speak out loud. And you become an expert at pushing those things away. You distract yourself, you just keep functioning. You tell yourself you have no reason to complain. And at the same time you sense you're drifting further from yourself. That this constant being good isn't genuine, that it doesn't heal, that it isolates you. The loneliest isolation isn't when you're alone, it's when you're among people and no one sees how you really are. I remember one evening out with friends. We laughed, drank, talked. Everything was as usual. And yet I sat there feeling, I'm not here. I'm only physically present. My real self was somewhere way back inside me, locked up, silent, observing. And in that moment I knew, this is no longer bearable. Not for me. I began, slowly, to take off the mask. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but tentatively, uncertainly, sometimes contradictorily. I started not answering fine automatically when asked, "How are you?" I allowed that sometimes I had nothing to say. I stopped forcing myself to always have a solution. I permitted myself to be honest, even if that meant I became vulnerable. And that wasn't easy. Because suddenly, I was no longer the one cheering others up. Suddenly, I was someone who needed space, someone who wasn't always upbeat, someone who didn't gloss over everything. And that caused some people to pull away. Some didn't understand. Some refused to understand. And yes, it hurt to realize that my real self wasn't welcome everywhere. But it was healing, because at the same time, new spaces began to open. More honest conversations, deeper connections. And above all, I began to feel myself again. Not just the pleasant parts, but everything. I was no longer running from myself. I learned that happiness isn't about always being in a good mood. It's about being fully present with everything that is. I learned that I can be loved even when I'm not functioning, that I don't always have to be strong to be valuable, that it's a sign of strength to take yourself seriously, even when it gets uncomfortable. I learned that people who truly see you don't only love you in the light, but in the shadows too. And I realized that my whole life I had tried to be someone people could like, instead of someone true to myself. The mask of happiness was the hardest, because it had been part of my identity for so many years. I had internalized it so deeply that I could no longer tell it apart from my real face. It gave me protection, but also distance. It let me function, but never really feel. Today I know I'm not always happy, I'm not always strong, I'm not always in a good mood. And that is what makes me human. Authentic, real. I wear no mask anymore. Not because I'm not afraid, but because I've finally understood that it's not worth living a life that isn't mine. Chapter 3. The Trap of Waiting for Permission. It often starts inconspicuously, almost harmlessly. You wait for a moment. You want to say something, but you hesitate. You feel a need, but you hold back. You have an idea, an impulse, a desire, and yet you slam on the brakes internally. Not because you don't know what you want, but because you've ingrained somewhere deep inside that you may only act when someone else says it's okay, when someone else approves, when someone else gives you the green light to be yourself now. It's that silent, invisible dependency that doesn't announce itself loudly, but sneaks quietly into your decisions. You don't make the wrong decisions. You don't make any. You wait for the sign, for consent, for a nod that signals you're not too much, not too demanding, not too different. And you only notice when you catch yourself postponing things that matter to you. When you make yourself small in conversations because you don't want to rock the boat. When you hold back your opinion even though it's long been there, clear and felt. When you ask others for advice, even though you already know what you want to do. But you don't dare trust yourself. You wait to see if it's allowed. That's not a conscious choice. It's a pattern. One that took root because you learned long ago that it's safer to conform. That approval is more valuable than clarity. That recognition counts more than self-respect. And the longer you live by this pattern, the less you can tell where you end and others' expectations begin. I remember a time when I always felt I wasn't far enough along, that I didn't know enough, that I wasn't ready. I had 1,000 reasons to do nothing. I waited for more experience, more security, better timing. And in truth, I was waiting for someone to come along and say, "Now you may. Now you're ready. Now it's okay." But no one came. And eventually it dawned on me. No one is coming. No one holds that authority over my life, except me. I was the one holding myself back. I was the one locking the door to my own path while I waited outside for a key that would never arrive. And when I truly understood that, I felt both angry and sad. Angry that I'd wasted so many years waiting, with consideration, with conformity. Sad that I realized how often I'd overridden myself, how often I'd sensed what I needed, and yet didn't allow it. For fear of failure, for fear of rejection, for fear of not pleasing someone. We grow up believing we must earn our place, that we must perform to be recognized, that we must follow rules we didn't write. And eventually we internalize that structure so deeply that we no longer trust ourselves if our desires don't match others' expectations. But the life you want to live will never be officially approved for you. It won't be validated. It won't be authorized. It's up to you to take it. When I began making decisions without justification, it felt at first like losing control. I was used to securing everything, constantly second-guessing myself. And now suddenly listening to my own feeling, that was unfamiliar. But with every step it became clearer. I don't have to ask anyone's permission to live my life. I don't have to convince anyone. I don't even have to be understood to be real. Of course there are consequences. Not everyone can handle it when you stop explaining yourself, when you no longer ask if something is okay, when you just do it. But that's part of it. There will be people who were used to your former self, the version of you that was agreeable, cautious, quiet. And those people lose something when you change. But you gain yourself back. The trap of waiting for permission is insidious because it makes you believe you're reasonable, cautious, mature, while you're really just blocked, paralyzed by inner voices that aren't even yours. And the only way out is to do it anyway. Even without guarantees, even without applause. I remember the first moment I decided something just for me. It wasn't big, not world-shaking, but it was mine. No compromise, no weighing pros and cons, no reassurance. I did it because I wanted to. And that moment had a power I'll never forget. Not because of the choice itself, but because I felt free for the first time. Not because I could do what I wanted, but because I had permitted myself to want it. And that permission, the quiet, honest, inner one, was the beginning of everything. Since then, I know, what I need doesn't come from outside, not in the form of confirmation, not through approval, not through silent consent. It begins where I stop shrinking to avoid overwhelming anyone, where I stop waiting for a sign I could have given myself long ago. Today I allow myself things I once wouldn't have even thought of. I allow myself to doubt and still move forward. I allow myself to make mistakes without judgment. I allow myself to say no without explanation. I allow myself to write my own story, even if it makes others uncomfortable. And I know now, the greatest freedom isn't in being permitted to do what you want. It's in no longer needing to justify yourself when you do it. Chapter 4. Stopping to serve others' expectations. It starts earlier than you realize. You look around, feel the glances, sense the subtle differences between approval and disapproval, and learn how to behave to please. Not because anyone explicitly demands it, but because you understand how things work, what succeeds, what's expected of you. And with every well done, every approving nod, a role quietly forms, one that works, one that fits, one in which you receive recognition, but gradually lose yourself. I was good at it. I knew how to be so everything ran smoothly. I was helpful, polite, reliable, adaptable. I could read what people wanted and deliver. I was the one who always had things under control, who never took too much, who blended in, who burdened no one. And I got what everyone wants in return: confirmation, belonging, respect, at least on the surface. What I didn't get was space. Space to truly be myself. Because the problem with always being right is that eventually you no longer know who you are when no one's watching, when no one expects anything, when you're not filling a role, not serving a function. You forget what you want because you're too busy being what others need. It's a quiet betrayal, not one that hurts like a blow, more like a constant, gentle pressure, like a jacket that never fits quite right, but you keep wearing because everyone says it suits you. And one day you notice you don't remember what it feels like to breathe freely. I long believed that it was my character, this urge to give, to help, to adapt. I thought it was part of my essence. But if you're really honest, if you listen deep within, you realize there's more. A longing you keep pushing away. A need to be seen not for what you do, but for who you are when you do nothing. When you don't function. When you simply exist. And that's the turning point. The moment you begin to feel that you've sacrificed yourself for an image, for a place that may never have truly been yours, for a role you assumed without noticing, and you start asking yourself if it was worth it. If the love you received was worth bending yourself so much. If the respect you earned was worth constantly holding yourself back. It's hard to break free from this dynamic. Not because something stands in your way, but because you built your entire system around it. Your self-image, your relationships, your decisions. Everything is designed to function. When you suddenly question that, everything wobbles. And that's scary, because what remains when you stop serving? What remains is truth. And at first it's uncomfortable, because it shows you how often you denied yourself to conform. It shows you how many compromises you made, not out of love, but out of fear. It shows you how often you didn't take yourself seriously to preserve harmony. And it also shows you that you could change it at any time, if you're willing to risk not fitting in anymore. I remember a moment when I clearly felt enough. I was in a conversation, once again agreeing, polite, nodding, though everything in me screamed no. I played the role perfectly, but inside I was empty. And in that moment I knew I couldn't pretend it was okay one more time. I simply couldn't. It wasn't about creating drama or rebelling loudly. It was about finally stopping the self-betrayal. And no, it wasn't instantly liberating. It was chaotic. It was exhausting. Because when you stop functioning, people start asking questions. They're surprised. They're irritated. Some withdraw. Some feel affronted. But you know what? That's okay. Because in that chaos, in that first unsure attempt at being yourself, lies more life than in all the years of smooth functioning. You begin to feel how you reconnect with yourself. You begin to notice what you want and what you don't. You rediscover your own voice, not as an echo of expectations, but as an honest sound from within. And the more you take yourself seriously, the less willing you are to conform again. That doesn't mean you become inconsiderate. It means you stop denying yourself. It means you no longer fit into roles that harm you. It means you don't contort yourself for belonging, because you understand that real connection is only possible when you're fully present, not as the version people expect, but as you. Today I live differently. Not perfectly, not without conflict, but more honestly. I say no more often. I do things that suit me, even if not everyone likes them. I decide how I fill my place in this world. And sometimes I fall flat. But I fall as myself, and that makes all the difference. Because when you stop serving others' expectations, you begin serving yourself. Not out of spite, but from the deep knowledge that you're no one's asset when you lose yourself. Chapter 5. The times I said yes, while my inner voice screamed no. There are those small moments you'd rather skip over because they pass quickly and seem harmless. Someone asks you for something. You hesitate for a split second, and before you've even thought it through, you hear yourself say, "Yes, of course." And inside, everything clenches. Not because you're a bad person, not because you don't want to help or are selfish, but because something in you clearly feels, "This isn't right for me. Not now. Not like this. Not again." But you say yes anyway. You say yes because it's easier, because you don't want an argument, because you want to avoid disappointing someone. You say yes because you learned that you're liked when you're available, when you care, when you adapt. You say yes because you never learned to put yourself first. And that pattern gnaws slowly through your life. I said yes so many times, though I wailed inside, not out loud, not visibly. It was a mute, resigned, weary no. A no that backed down because it had no room. I said yes to gatherings where I had to pretend, to favors that were too much for me, to conversations that drained me. I said yes to keep the peace, though inside I was already at war. It was never a conscious decision. It was a reflex, an automatic response. And the longer I kept it up, the quieter my inner no became. At some point it was barely audible, and then I labeled it helpfulness or consideration. I talked myself into believing adaptation was normal, that it came with being part of something. But deep down, something was accumulating. A fatigue, an anger, a bitterness I couldn't name. I felt drained, though I did nothing special. I had less desire for people, less patience. I began to dislike myself because I continually crossed my own boundaries, and at the same time blamed others for it. Not until one day I completely overreacted over a trivial matter did I realize, I'm not overwhelmed because others demand too much. I'm overwhelmed because I'm constantly betraying my own instincts. I'm not tired of life. I'm tired of myself, of my constant readiness to put myself last. And when I admitted that to myself honestly, it hit me like a wave. Because I had to confess I'd never learned to name my boundaries. I could feel them. I sensed when something was too much. But I had no words for it. No clear no. No stop. I don't want this right now. And each time I overrode myself, my inner trust shrank a bit more. I could no longer believe myself. I could no longer take myself seriously. Because if I knew what was right for me but didn't live it, what was it worth? For a long time, saying no felt like risking rejection. The risk that someone would be disappointed, that someone would be angry, and above all, that I'd come across as difficult. And that thought terrified me more than anything. I didn't want to be difficult. I wanted to be liked. I wanted to belong. But eventually I reached a point where I no longer liked myself. And that was the real turning point. I began practicing my no. Quietly, tentatively, imperfectly. I said no to small things and endured the reactions. I learned I'm not responsible for how others handle my boundary, that I'm not a bad person for honoring myself, that real relationships don't break when I show my limits. They grow. And I also learned that every clear no to others is a yes to myself, not out of spite, but because I finally began to take myself seriously, because I stopped betraying myself to please others, because I understood that my needs aren't less valuable, even if I ignored them for a long time. Today, I know. A clear no is an act of self-respect. It's not a rejection, but a decision. It's no attack, but protection. And yes, it takes courage, especially at first. But nothing reconciles you with yourself more than the moment you stay true to yourself, even when it's uncomfortable. I still don't say no in every situation. Sometimes I fall back into old patterns, but I notice it sooner. I can course correct faster, and I forgive myself when I don't succeed immediately, because this new behavior isn't a switch you flip. It's a process, a learning, a remembering that your voice matters. When I look back now, I see all those situations clearly, the ones where I overrode my gut feeling. I see myself smiling, nodding, agreeing, though inside every fiber of me protested. And I feel compassion, not shame, not anger. Compassion for the version of me that didn't know better, that believed self-denial was the price for belonging. But today I know. I no longer want to belong if it means I must disappear. I don't want a connection that only stands when I conform. I want relationships where my no is as welcome as my yes. And I want a life where I no longer have to watch myself give in. It doesn't start with a grand revolt. It starts with a quiet sentence that comes from within, and that you long denied yourself. No, not this time. And once you say that sentence out loud, everything changes. Chapter 6. It's not about self-love. It's about respect. I've heard countless times how important self-love is. It's on posters, in books, on social media posts, almost as if someone decided the solution to everything is simply to love yourself. And for a while, I tried to believe that. I read affirmations, did mirror exercises, tried to flood my inner world with kind words. Yet no matter how hard I tried, something felt off. Not because the idea was bad, but because it came too early. I couldn't love myself because I didn't respect myself. How can you feel genuine affection for yourself when you override yourself every single day? How is love supposed to grow if you ignore your boundaries, deny your needs, keep putting yourself last just to perform for the world? Self-love isn't a state you summon with positive thinking. It grows out of how you treat yourself. And that was my problem. I was kind to everyone, except myself. I often caught myself shrinking so as not to disturb anyone, tolerating things that hurt me, forgiving too quickly, questioning too little, swallowing too much, all in the name of harmony. I was so busy appearing peaceful on the outside that inside I was waging a constant war against myself. And no, I didn't hate myself. There was no dramatic crash. It was subtler. I simply didn't take myself seriously. Respect. That was the real deficit. Not tenderness, not appreciation, but respect. That clear inner stance that says, I'm not less valuable just because someone else wants me to be different. I deserve protection, even if nobody else offers it. I have the right not to justify myself, to speak up, to walk away when something doesn't feel right. It took me a long time to see that, because respect doesn't begin with big decisions, dramatic breakups, or brave new starts. It begins in the small moments. The moment you feel you need a break, but still don't give it to yourself. When you know someone disappoints you again and again, but you stay out of politeness. When you rebel inwardly but not outwardly. Those are the moments that determine whether you stand by yourself or against yourself. And as I started paying attention, I realized how often I'd betrayed myself. Not loudly, not deliberately, but out of habit. I'd become my own blind spot. I'd grown so used to being the reasonable one, the understanding one, the one who always sees the big picture, that I no longer noticed how much of myself I'd lost in the process. Self-respect was a theoretical concept for me. I thought it had to do with pride, with posture, with an outward strength. But it wasn't that at all. it was much quieter. Self-respect means not stabbing yourself in the back, even if nobody sees it, nobody demands it, and it's uncomfortable. I began observing myself, not to criticize, but to become honest. And I noticed that every time I disappointed myself, I felt a small inner crack, a tiny tension, a lingering unease. And that I only felt truly good when I was clear. Not perfect, not flawless, but clear about what I would tolerate and what I wouldn't. I remember a conversation in which someone said something that struck me deeply. I would have smiled, brushed it off, shown understanding. This time I stayed calm, but I said firmly, that wasn't okay. I held my ground even when it got uncomfortable. Afterwards, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm, a deep, honest calm because I had stayed true to myself. And then I realized, this is what respect feels like. Not a high, not a triumph, but inner sincerity. A peace with myself because I refused to be bulldozed, refused to shrink, refused to be nice at the cost of my truth. From then on, many things changed. I stopped surrounding myself with people who constantly forced me to explain myself. I limited compromises to what I could bear. I stopped saying, it's not that bad. I began saying, enough. And even if that made me seem sensitive or demanding, I didn't care. Because I knew I would no longer function at the expense of my dignity. Self-love. Maybe it comes later. Maybe it isn't as crucial as we think. Maybe it's enough to respect yourself, to honor yourself, to listen to yourself. Not always. Not perfectly, but more and more. Perhaps that alone is enough to begin a new relationship with yourself. One that doesn't shout, but whispers, and is honest. I had to learn that it's not about constant self-optimization, celebration, or mirror masquerade. It's about no longer abandoning yourself. In the small moments, in the unseen decisions, in how you think about yourself when you're alone, in how you speak to yourself when you fail, in what you finally allow, and what you refuse to let happen. Respect isn't a posture you rehearse. It's a commitment. Quiet, but radical. And it begins the moment you start taking yourself seriously again. Chapter 7. What it feels like to lose yourself, and why sometimes you have to. Losing yourself isn't a dramatic moment when everything collapses. It isn't a cinematic breakdown, a clean cut. It feels much more diffuse. It often begins like a creeping fog that blurs the outlines. You still function, you still show up, you even laugh, but something is missing. You no longer recognize yourself in your own life. You move forward, but without direction, without connection, without that subtle feeling of being where you belong. I've lost myself more than once, and each time it was different. Sometimes from over-adapting, sometimes in a relationship where I slowly vanished, sometimes from a job that demanded everything but gave nothing back. And sometimes it was simply the sum of too many small decisions where I chose against myself, not out of malice, but out of fear, habit, or fatigue. It's so easy to lose sight of yourself when you're perpetually busy meeting expectations. But the feeling of going missing isn't only pain. It's emptiness, a kind of inner drifting, as if you're still there, but without footing. You go through the day, but nothing sticks. You speak, but the words mean little. You fulfill tasks, meet people, laugh at the same jokes, but none of it touches you. Everything feels observed from a distance, as if you're a spectator of your own routine. I remember one morning when I looked in the mirror and felt nothing. No anger, no dislike, but no connection either. I was there, but not fully me. And that was the moment I realized I'd lost myself. Not to a place or a person, but to a life I'd kept on autopilot long after it stopped being mine. What follows is often what many fear: disorientation, uncertainty, questions with no instant answers. You fall out of rhythm. You can't just carry on as before, but you also don't know where to go next. And that state feels brutal, because we're conditioned always to have an answer, to know where we're headed, to keep control. But it's precisely in that state, in the vacuum between your old self-image and your new truth, that something within you begins to stir. Quietly, but relentlessly. Not because you want it, but because you must. Because the old life no longer sustains you. Because you can't keep lying to yourself. Because functioning is no longer enough. You sense you can't go back, and you can't pretend any longer. And many rush to piece themselves back together, quickly, efficiently, anything to leave the chaos behind. But what I learned is, sometimes you have to lose yourself so that what no longer belongs to you can truly fall away. So you shed not only roles, but illusions. So you can start again, from zero, not as someone new, but as someone honest. I had to dissolve to discover what truly belonged to me. I had to lose certainty to grasp freedom. I had to endure emptiness to make room for what's real. And yes, it hurts. It isn't romantic. It isn't a poetic metaphor. It's real pain, real uncertainty, genuine fear. But it's also the doorway to a life you don't live on autopilot, but intentionally, awake and sincere. The moment I stopped desperately seeking answers, I began asking questions that weren't about efficiency, but about humanity. What do I really need? What do I believe about myself? And why? What have I done to survive that now keeps me from living? And the answers didn't come immediately. They came through experience, setbacks, silent evenings with myself. But they came. And eventually something like direction returned. Not in the form of a plan or to-do list, but in the feeling that I could sense myself again. That I made choices, not from fear, but from truth. That I found my own pace, my own measure, my own voice. That I no longer tried to become someone, but simply to be me, without efficiency, pressure, or perfection. I believe we will lose ourselves more than once in life, and that it's not failure, but a sign that we're changing, growing, looking honestly, not standing still. Losing yourself isn't the end. It's often the beginning of something more real, bolder, deeper. I wish someone had told me earlier, it's okay if you don't know who you are right now. It's not a fault or a weakness. It's a necessary break when what you are no longer holds, and what you will be has no shape yet. And it's okay to stay there, even if it's uncomfortable, even if others don't understand, even if you don't understand yourself. Because on the other side of that process isn't a version of you that just fits better, but one that is finally real. One that doesn't have to have everything under control, that doesn't always have to be strong, that can feel itself again even when it hurts, and that no longer wakes up to a life that feels wrong just because it once felt right. Chapter 8. Discomfort as Compass. If you've spent a long time avoiding conflict, staying under the radar, navigating situations as smoothly as possible, you learn to treat discomfort as a warning sign, something bad you must eliminate as quickly as possible. And that's the real problem. Not the discomfort itself, but the reflex to push it away instead of listening to it. It took me years to realize that the very feeling I fled from was the clearest indicator of where I needed to go. Discomfort rarely feels good. It makes you nervous. It knocks you off balance. It unsettles, questions, pulls you out of routine. It's uncomfortable because it forces you to look where you'd rather look away. Yet it's often the only honest guide you have. Because where it tingles, tightens, or presses, that's usually the part of your life that really needs change. I remember thinking for a long time that I just needed better organization, more planning, more control. Then the discomfort would vanish. But no matter how hard I tried, no matter how right I structured my life, it stayed, like a quiet resistance inside me, like an inner nod every time I over-adapted, censored myself in conversation, said yes though I hesitated. This feeling was my constant companion, not loud, not threatening, but persistent. Eventually I stopped fighting it. I began to take it seriously. Not everything that feels bad is bad for you. Sometimes it's just unfamiliar, unknown, and often it's exactly what you need to break out of your own circle, because comfort traps you. The familiar protects you, but it also keeps you small. It says, stay here, you know how it works. But discomfort says, something's off. Look closer, move on. I began to recognize that my body often knew before my mind did what my mind refused to admit. The tightness in my chest when I had to pretend. The flutter in my stomach when a choice didn't align. The inner tension when I acted only to meet expectations. It wasn't imagination. It was data. Pure, unfiltered truth. Discomfort isn't an enemy. It's a signal, and it loses its threat when you stop fighting it. I learned to step into zones where I felt uncertain, into conversations that required courage, into decisions that weren't pre-made, into spaces where I didn't know if I fit, but still wanted to enter. And the more I did it, the more I trusted myself, not because it was easy, but because I felt something grows here, even if it's not comfortable right now. Discomfort led me back to aliveness. It showed me what I'd been avoiding, and precisely what I had to face. It taught me that freedom doesn't blossom when everything feels easy. Freedom often begins exactly where you first feel unsafe, but keep going anyway. Yes, it takes energy. Those zones aren't stable. They raise questions. They make you vulnerable. But they also make you real. Because in those moments you stop hiding behind routines and old patterns. Because you're forced to feel yourself instead of numbing out with distraction, approval, or habit. I no longer believe life should always be easy. I believe there must be phases where we're unsure of our footing, do things that feel strange, grow precisely because we feel uncomfortable. And I believe true growth almost never happens quietly. It rumbles, it presses, it sometimes hurts, but it's real. And that reality is the only place where you can truly meet yourself. I eventually understood that my craving for security was often just another word for stagnation, that my pursuit of harmony too often came at the expense of my inner truth, and that my attempt to please everyone did protect me, but never fulfilled me. Today I deliberately ask, where do I feel resistance, and why? What exactly scares me here? And is this fear a signal of danger? Or might it be a sign I'm leaving an old protective shell behind? And I no longer answer these questions in my head. I answer them in my body, in how I breathe when I make a decision, in how my spine straightens when I stay true to myself, in the calm that comes when I invite discomfort to walk alongside me. Because that's what I want to tell you. Discomfort doesn't have to be your enemy. It can be your compass. Not the easiest, not the loudest, but often the most honest. It won't lead you directly to your destination, but it'll keep you from following paths no longer meant for you. It challenges you, yes, but it also shows you where you stop functioning and start feeling. And that's where a life begins. You don't steer from the outside, but from within. Chapter 9. The exhaustion of playing a life that isn't yours. There's a tiredness no sleep can cure, an exhaustion deeper than any physical strain. It doesn't come from too much work, too few breaks, or classic stress. It comes from the inner split between what you're doing and who you really are. From the daily performance you keep up even though you know you never truly chose the role. I know this exhaustion, not as a sudden collapse, but as a constant, low-grade ache. I would wake up, perform, move through the day, smile, speak, blend in, while losing a bit of energy with each action. Not because I accomplished nothing, but because none of it aligned with me. Because with every decision born of fear instead of truth, I gave away a piece of my power. It's paradoxical. You look strong on the outside, resilient, composed, but inside you're burning out. Not in flames, but in that slow, smoldering glow that never quite dies, yet never really warms. You keep going because you believe it must be this way. That responsibility demands it. That you fulfill expectations. That you adapt or life falls apart. And eventually you don't even notice that you're living a life you play, rather than live. I remember one evening coming home, closing the door, and just sitting there. No TV, no phone, no noise, just me. And suddenly, there was this weight. No specific thought, no single trigger, just a deep, dull feeling of fatigue, of inner emptiness, of knowing I wasn't showing up in my own life, that I kept everything running, but I myself had long since stalled. This exhaustion doesn't happen overnight. It's the result of years of overlooking yourself, of habits you never questioned, of expectations you inherited as though they were yours, of a success narrative that never originated in your heart, yet drove you relentlessly. And the longer you stay in that state, the less energy you have to change. Not because you lack courage, but because you simply lack the strength to be yourself again. I believe many people walk through life this way, armed with to-do lists, obligations, expectations, yet internally hollow. They do what's required, play assigned roles, function. When asked how they are, they'll say, "Fine, just a bit tired." And that's the tragedy. We accept this kind of exhaustion as normal, as inevitable, as the price of stability. But eventually, enough is enough. A point comes when you can't lie to yourself any longer. When you realize that though you keep everything under control, nothing of it fulfills you. When you understand you can't continue, even if you don't yet know how to do it differently. And that's exactly where something new begins. Not out of clarity, not from a sudden awakening, but from deep, honest exhaustion. I began asking myself long-suppressed questions. Which parts of this are truly mine? What decisions did I make to be seen, not to be me? Which compromises cost me inside? And with each honest answer, a bit of strength returned. No euphoria, no, now I'll change everything moment, but something quieter, something more real. I started doing less, accomplishing less, pleasing less. I declined invitations I'd once accepted out of obligation. I spoke truths I would have swallowed before. I stayed away from places that drained me. And suddenly, I had energy again. Not because I became lazier, but because I stopped betraying myself. That's what costs the most energy. Not daily life, not work, not responsibility, but the constant bending, masking, performing. It's the inner marathon of adaptation that exhausts you, not life itself. And yes, it takes courage to end the performance. You'll ruffle feathers. You won't please everyone. Some will be unsettled. Some might even be disappointed. But what awaits on the other side is not loneliness. It's authenticity. A kind of presence that isn't loud but palpable. That says, I'm here again. Not perfect. Not always strong. But I'm here. Today I closely watch where my energy goes. Not out of selfishness, but out of respect. I no longer ask what others expect before I decide how to show up. I ask myself, Can I align this with myself? Will it make me feel more alive or emptier? Because in the end, that's the difference between a life you play and one you live. Whether you feel yourself doing it, whether you meet yourself in it, whether at day's end you think, not only did I perform, but I also was me. And that's what I wish for everyone. Not the perfect life, not grand success, but the clarity to notice when you're losing yourself and the courage to find your way back. Chapter 10. When you realize you're not responsible for keeping exhausting relationships alive. Few burdens are as subtle as a relationship that's dead inside but still functions outwardly. You call because you feel you should. You listen because it's expected. You stay connected because that's how it's always been, not because it nourishes you. And all the while, you sense more and more. The bond that once lifted you now pulls you down. It costs you more energy than it returns. And you begin to see that not every relationship that once accompanied you must stay. I long believed loyalty meant enduring, staying, showing understanding, making compromises, even when it hurt. I thought it was part of my character to nurture relationships, even if they demanded more than they nourished. I held on, thinking it was the right thing to do. But with every draining conversation, every encounter after which I felt empty, I realized something's wrong. Not with the other person, not even with me, but with the belief that I'm responsible for others' emotional balance. We're taught that relationships require work, that you must persevere, not walk away when it gets tough. And yes, to an extent that's true, but what's never said out loud is, you're allowed to let go. You're allowed to step away when it no longer serves you. You're allowed to protect yourself when the bond becomes a burden. And above all, you're not obligated to contort yourself forever just to preserve old connections. It wasn't a sudden break, but a slow awakening. After conversations, I began tuning into my body rather than words. Did I feel constricted or expansive? Could I breathe around this person? Or was I holding my breath inside? These weren't accusations, but insights. That I abandoned myself out of obligation. That I lost pieces of me in connections where my real self had no place. It's hard to say it aloud. I can't do this anymore. Not because you're bad, but because I'm the one who no longer recognizes myself here. I carried these words inside for a long time, afraid I'd seem selfish or hurtful. Yet that honesty brought me back to myself. Because if you feel responsible for others' emotions for years, you lose access to your own. I had to learn that I owe nobody an explanation when I protect myself. That I don't have to endure everything just because I once let someone in. That past closeness is not a lifelong contract. And that real relationships don't survive on maintenance. They thrive on genuine encounter. Of course, doubts arose. Was I ungrateful? Overwhelmed? Too sensitive? But the longer I stayed true to myself, the clearer it became. I may choose what remains in my life. I may filter who gets access. I may leave certain dynamics, not out of spite, but out of clarity. Self-respect is also relationship care, namely the one with your center. People change. Connections change. And sometimes they were never what you thought. Your responsibility is to see that, and not pretend what's not true. I remember a person I'd been close to for years. A relationship full of shared history, experiences, life. But I realized our conversations only existed in memories. I was too afraid to show my real present because I knew it'd be met with incomprehension. I started to keep quiet for peace, and found that silence weighed heavier than any spoken word. When I finally distanced myself, there was no drama, no big confrontation, just quiet. And with that quiet came relief. Not because I devalued the other, but because I felt myself again. because I no longer stayed in a dynamic that cost more than I was willing to give. It's not about ejecting people the moment things get hard, nor about only staying with those who always please you. It's about honesty, about seeing when you give more than you can bear, and acting accordingly, not out of harshness, but out of clarity. You're not here to keep every relationship afloat. You're not responsible for how others feel when you set boundaries. You may decide which connections empower you and which drain you, and you may walk away, even if no one understands, even if it's never spoken, even if you hesitate. Because your life isn't a stage where you exhaust yourself to avoid loneliness. It's the space where you choose how to stay connected, and with whom. And sometimes the bravest move isn't to stay, but to leave quietly and remain true to yourself. Chapter 11. The importance of disappointing others to avoid betraying yourself. Some decisions feel hard not because they're wrong, but because you know someone else won't like them. You know what you want to do. You feel clearly what's right for you. And yet you hesitate because you know someone will be disappointed, maybe sad, maybe angry, maybe confused. And you don't want that. You don't want to be a problem. You don't want to hurt anybody. So you start negotiating, not with others, but with yourself. I often delayed decisions because I didn't want to bear someone else's disappointment. I took on projects I no longer had energy for. I said yes to invitations when I longed to retreat. I held back in conversations just to avoid awkwardness. And each time I chose not to disappoint someone else, I disappointed myself a little more. Not immediately, not visibly, but tangibly. Like when you drown out your own voice. Like when you shrink yourself to fit someone else's picture. That quiet, gnawing feeling that lingers long after the moment has passed. We grow up believing consideration for others is good. And it is. But what's often forgotten is that consideration for others must never become neglect of yourself. When you keep putting yourself last so others don't have to face your truth, you pay a price every single day. You become calmer, more accommodating, even more pleasant. But you also become emptier because you can no longer trust yourself when you continually violate your own boundaries just to avoid disappointing anyone. And eventually you begin to see yourself as the problem, when really you're just someone trying not to be a burden at any cost. I learned the hard way that disappointing others is part of life, and that doesn't make you unloving, but clear. It doesn't make you thoughtless, but honest. Someone may be disappointed when you stay true to yourself, not because you set out to hurt them, but because your truth doesn't always fit their expectations. I remember a conversation with a close friend who expected something I couldn't give. I hesitated, tried to soften my words, skirted around the issue, qualified, downplayed, until I realized that one more sentence would cost me my integrity. So I said calmly, "I know this disappoints you, and I still can't do it." Silence followed, but I stood my ground. Not harshly or defiantly, but clearly. And in that clarity I felt a dignity I hadn't known in years. People who truly love you can be disappointed, and they stay. Maybe not everyone, maybe not instantly, but eventually they grasp that your truth isn't against them, but for you, and that a genuine connection must make room for that. Disappointment isn't something to run from. It's a natural part of any relationship where people grow. The more you become yourself, the less you'll fit the image others have of you. And that's not your problem. It's part of their story, their expectations, their ideas. You're not responsible for what someone else believes about you. What you are responsible for is your own actions, your integrity, your relationship with yourself. There's a form of clarity that's quiet, but unwavering. One that doesn't have to shout, yet remains. Doesn't provoke, yet never retreats. That clarity comes when you stop denying yourself to make others' lives easier. When you start holding your truth, even when it challenges someone else. I learned that I'm not a good person by pleasing everyone. I'm a real person by making decisions that resonate with me, even when they shatter expectations. The aim is not to hurt no one, but to hurt no one intentionally. And that makes all the difference. Vulnerability isn't just expressing feelings, it's risking not being understood, perhaps even judged, yet staying true to yourself. It takes courage to hold that space, to ask yourself in the mirror, am I honest just to be comfortable? Or am I comfortable by being honest? The hardest moments of my life weren't when I was disappointed. They were when I disappointed myself to avoid discomfort. The evenings I looked in the mirror, knowing I hadn't acted as I should, only to be liked. Nothing hurt more than that. Today I know. I can't stop people from making up their own image of me. But I can decide whether to play that role or to live who I really am. And if that means sometimes shattering expectations, so be it. Not out of indifference, but out of love for myself. I have no responsibility to live a life that soothes others. I have a responsibility to live a life I can stand by, even when no one's watching. Chapter 12. Life owes you nothing, but you owe yourself everything. It's easy to slip into the mindset that life owes you something, especially when you've given so much, tried so hard, endured, suffered, fought, yet still feel that what you get back is so out of proportion to what you invested. You look around, compare, wonder why others seem to glide ahead effortlessly while you keep running in place. And deep inside you whisper, this can't be all there is. I deserve more. But life doesn't answer to what you deserve. It responds to what you do, what you allow, what you're willing to give, not for others, but for yourself. And as harsh as it sounds, life owes you nothing. There is no guarantee of justice. No invisible bank account where your patience, sacrifice, and endurance collect interest. The only thing you can rely on is yourself. I refused to see that for a long time. I believed that if I just endured enough, sacrificed enough, worked harder, eventually everything would fall into place. Someone would notice my efforts. One day it would pay off. Then, when it didn't, I grew angry. First at others, then at myself, and finally at life itself. Until I realized the problem wasn't that I got too little, but that I demanded too little. Not loudly, not aggressively, but inwardly. I never really claimed what was rightfully mine, from myself. So much of what we expect from outside, respect, recognition, care, clarity, starts within us. You can't wait for life to give you what you keep denying yourself. You can't hope to be seen if you never look yourself in the eye. You can't lead a fulfilled life if you're merely surviving. Above all, you can't stand tall if you're still kneeling inside. I had to admit I wasn't betrayed. I had allowed my standards for myself to be lower than for anyone else. I showed up for others long before I showed up for myself. I was loyal, understanding, generous, except to myself. I forgave mistakes, respected boundaries, made space, just not for my own needs. I treated myself like a second priority. And that had to change. Not because I was owed it, not because I was a victim, but because I understood. If I want to be taken seriously in this world, I must first take myself seriously. No one will arrive to give me what I won't give myself. It was a slow process. No sudden enlightenment, no dramatic shift, but a series of small, consistent decisions. I began asking what I needed, not what I should do, what was convenient, or what everyone else expected. I started saying no, even when it caused friction. I allowed myself rest, even when it was unproductive. I spoke up when something wasn't right, even when it was uncomfortable. And with each choice grew a feeling I hadn't known: self-respect. Not pride, not superiority, but that quiet assurance that I'm on my own side. That I no longer wait for someone to rescue me. That I no longer live in the fantasy that if I function long enough, life will automatically reward me. Rather, I have the power every day to give myself what I need. I believe many people know deep down what they lack, but they wait for better circumstances, more courage, a sign, and they persevere, placate themselves, keep functioning, and years slip by, and they find themselves living someone else's life, hoping it will someday fit them. But that won't happen. If you keep neglecting yourself, shrinking to avoid standing out, postponing your own needs because you believe others must come first. If you wait, you grow weary. If you act, you become clear. And that's the turning point. Realizing you have no one to prove anything to, except yourself. You owe no one anything, except yourself. You don't need applause, pat on the back, or external validation to stop neglecting yourself. You just need to decide not to treat yourself as secondary in your own life. Now, I don't live perfectly, but I live more consciously. I no longer ask what life owes me. I ask what I owe myself, and whether I'm willing to insist on it daily, not from others, but from me, in my words, in my choices, in how I speak to myself when no one else is listening. Because life won't give you what you deserve, but you can give yourself what you need if you're ready to own that responsibility. Chapter 13. Fear never vanishes. You learn to walk through it. Fear isn't a glitch in the system. It isn't a sign of weakness or proof that you're not ready. It isn't the problem. It's part of the path. And understanding that changed everything for me. I long tried to rid myself of it. I believed that if only I were braver, more determined, more focused, the fear would vanish. Then the lump in my throat, the twist in my gut, the paralysis whenever something truly mattered would disappear. But it didn't. No matter how much I waited, no matter how much I prepared, no matter how many safeguards I built, the fear was always there. Especially when things got serious. When I had to speak a truth that mattered. When I faced a choice that would shift my life. When I finally stopped living by others' expectations and started living by what felt right for me. Fear arrived every time I began to be genuine. I tried to ignore it. Called it nervousness, doubt, caution. I downplayed it, pretended I had it under control. But it controlled me, because I never learned to move with it. I tried to sidestep it, and so I remained stuck. Then I realized the problem wasn't the fear itself, but my relationship with it, my resistance, my wish to banish it before I moved. And in that wish, I got trapped. I waited for a state that never came. Calm, light, secure. That moment never arrives, because fear never disappears. It stays, but you can learn to move despite it. It was a shift in perspective, not a grand aha, but a slow dawning. I began to wonder, what if I simply take fear along with me? Don't fight it, don't purge it, just show up with it. I started small. I spoke when my voice trembled. I asked when my heart raced. I decided when everything inside begged me to retreat. And I noticed nothing terrible happened. I was afraid, and I did it anyway. That was the turning point. Because courage doesn't feel strong. It feels shaky, unsteady, hesitant. But it's there when you act despite the fear. When you stop waiting for it to vanish and understand that it only grows louder the more you avoid it, that it doesn't dissolve when you hide, but when you step into the light. I've seen so many people believe they can only start once they feel no fear, so they postpone projects, dodge conversations, delay decisions, all because they think the timing must feel perfect. But it never will. It will never be completely easy or entirely safe, and by waiting, you grow tired. Not because you do too little, but because you block your own growth. Now I see fear differently. I notice it. I look it in the eye. I don't ask its permission. I say, you may come, but you don't lead. And that changes everything. Because the moment you refuse to let fear define you, you begin to feel your freedom. You stop hiding from life just because it shakes you. You begin to show up, trembling, sweating, heart pounding, but alive. Fear isn't the end of movement. It's a sign you're on a path that matters. It doesn't come when you're doing meaningless things. It comes when it's real, when you risk, when you reveal yourself, when you dare to change. That's why it's so precious. It marks the boundary of your comfort and shows you where you can grow, not by removing it, but by walking through it. Today, I often set out with fear by my side. I write texts that matter to me, uncertain how they'll land. I speak truths I long hid, unsure of the reception. I choose challenges that test me and carry my trembling with me. But I move, and that's the difference. Not that I feel no fear, but that I move anyway. Fear belongs, but it no longer steers. I do. Chapter 14. The reasonable excuses that still hold you back. Not every block feels like a wall. Sometimes it disguises itself as a reasonable thought, a logical explanation, a perfectly good reason why the timing isn't right. That's what makes these blocks so dangerous. They don't feel like excuses. They feel like responsibility, maturity, wise deliberation. They don't slam into you. They whisper softly, "This just isn't the moment." I often stood on the edge, ready, yet reluctant, and an inner voice would say, "You need more time. You should gain more experience. You need to prepare better. Only when you're 100% sure can you begin." And because that voice sounded so sensible, I believed it. I believed I was being prudent, when in reality, I was paralyzed. This form of excuse doesn't hurt you. It doesn't spark conflict. It lets you sleep peacefully, at least on the surface. That's why it's so insidious. You don't notice you're the one holding yourself back. You call it planning. You call it responsibility. You call it maturity. But really it's fear in disguise. Well-dressed, highly skilled, and it traps you because you think it's protecting you. I remember a project I carried in my heart for years. It was vivid, alive, but I told myself the timing was off. I needed to grow more, sort out other things first. I consulted people, gathered opinions, planned, structured, postponed. And then I realized I wasn't planning. I was avoiding. Because once you truly move, it gets serious. You become visible. Things can go wrong. You can make mistakes. That's precisely what the reasonable excuse shields you from. It makes you think you're in control, holding the strings. But in truth, you're the one staying put, with arguments that sound good but leave you empty. It's not wrong to feel fear. It's human. But once you start dressing it up, rationalizing, justifying, you lose yourself. You begin to believe your own fabrications. And the longer you do, the harder it is to see clearly. The deeper you sink into a comfortable passivity that doesn't feel like stagnation, yet is exactly that. What I needed to learn wasn't how to defeat fear, but how to unmask these excuses. I had to take myself by the hand and honestly ask, is this really a valid reason, or a flight into safety? Am I becoming wiser, or just more cowardly? And that honesty was uncomfortable because it forced me to ask whether I was ready to take myself seriously. The truth is, many of these excuses work perfectly. Others even endorse them. Take your time. Better safe than sorry. You've still got time. And you want to believe them. You want to nestle in their approval. But deep down you know, they only see your facade, the calm you project, not the inner tremor that's begging you to act. I'm not advocating headlong frenzy, rushing everything. It's not about ignoring risk. It's about recognizing when your reasons aren't real reasons, but smokescreens. When you trick yourself, even though you know what you must do. And when you stop convincing yourself something's missing, when really only one thing is, your step forward. Now I ask not whether I'm ready, but whether I'm hiding. I no longer wait for perfect timing. I ask what I'm willing to risk, not for success, but for authenticity. And often I'm not sure. My body still quivers. But I know. Every honest move brings more life than every perfectly planned escape. I learned that no excuse feels good in hindsight, none. Because you always feel you sidestepped yourself with arguments that sounded wise but wounded you in silence. So today I believe the bravest sentence isn't "I am not afraid," but "I will do it despite my fear." Not "I'm ready," but "I begin now and learn along the way." You don't need to know everything before you start. You don't need to be perfectly prepared. You just need to decide to stop delaying yourself. Because everything that holds you back isn't out there. It lives inside you, and you know it well. You've even given it a respectable name that makes you feel safe, even though it's the very thing that chains you. If you're postponing something today, ask, would I do this if no one were watching? If no one judged me? If I didn't have to prove anything? If the answer is no, then you know you're not hesitating out of wisdom, but fear. And then it's on you. Stand still, or finally move. Chapter 15. Your story is not a punishment. There are no catch-all words that magically erase the past, no phrases that float you above old wounds. I feel that sharply when past experiences weigh on me like chains, stirring pain, anger, shame, making me believe what happened defines me. But your story, however deep or broad, isn't a verdict. It's the origin of this journey. I know that burden. I've carried parts of my past like heavy stones in a pocket I couldn't open. Memories that slowed me down in the here and now. Mistakes I replayed endlessly, as if my worth hinged on how well I could explain them. Shadows that stretched across every step, making everything darker than it was. I felt I'd cornered myself, believing my story had put me there. Then came a quiet awakening. The moment I realized that what happened doesn't equal what's meant to be. That wounds needn't remain forever raw. That pain can stay without defining the whole picture. And perhaps there was no final judgment on the past, but suddenly there was space for another understanding. Life as movement, growth, healing, freedom from condemnation. It wasn't one big leap, but many small ones. I began to view my experiences not as burdens, but as chapters. Things that shaped me, but never bound me. I saw my scars as proof that I'd survived. Not in the sense that I needed to display them daily or dissect why they were there, but simply to let them rest. I started talking about them. Not to lose myself in them, but to release them. That felt almost frightening. Claiming, "My story doesn't define me," meant nothing compared to how I felt when no one knew it. When I showed up without explanation, without shame, just presence. And it didn't feel light. It felt right. Because life isn't designed as punishment. It's structured so you grow through experiences, gain new perspectives, and discover where the shadows allow the light to shine through. I began to understand that pain doesn't block my future. It reveals what I cherish most, what I want to protect, what means something to me. And by realizing that, what was no longer stamped me with negativity, and everything changed. I started making decisions from clarity, not uncertainty. I said yes to situations that enriched me, even when they looked different from the past. I raised my voice, though it once grew quiet too soon. I redrew boundaries after learning that hurt wounds, but doesn't destroy me. And I felt in all that's happened a promise. I can go forward. I can stay. I can transform. Because the past isn't a rule book. It's part of the framework. That doesn't mean you're free of pain. You're not always healed. But you're no longer imprisoned by your past. You're not your mistakes, losses, or fears. You're the answer to them. And when you choose to step beyond that frame, all that happened steps into your own light. It loses power because you no longer give it any. I remember days when I couldn't speak of certain experiences without breaking down. Today I can tell the story without paralysis. Not because I'm stronger, but because I've accepted that what happened, happened, and who I am now is me, and who I'll become is still unfolding. No judgment, no condemnation, just a story that moves on, with me as its narrator, not its prisoner. This chapter is your permission slip, not to forget or prematurely forgive if you're not ready, but to understand that your story doesn't condemn you. It doesn't take anything away. If you're willing to anchor it in the present and keep moving forward, that you're not guilty of what happened. And no one feels that more than you feel it right now. Your story isn't your pride, but it isn't your sentence. It's simply a part. And what you do is keep walking with it, choosing each step whether to let it be your origin or to refuse it as a chain. That choice changes everything. Because the life you live isn't the outcome of what was, but of what you make of it today. Chapter 16. When you realize that the success you were sold doesn't fulfill you. Success is marketed to you like a package containing everything. A secure life, recognition, self-worth, wrapped up in status symbols, certificates, visible victories. We celebrate when someone climbs the career ladder, shines outwardly, or achieves what many dream of. Lots of money, influence, networks. And one day you may find you have it all, and still stare blankly when you wake up. I know that feeling well. Years I fought tooth and nail, chasing rankings, titles, milestones. I beat myself up for recognition, to prove that my life was worth something. I worked nights, gave up weekends, even put relationships on the back burner. And then, when the trophies piled up, there was no spark, no joy, no sense of, finally I've arrived. I felt that success couldn't fill me, ever so quietly. A gentle tug, barely audible, a vibration inside while applause rang out. Like an echo only I could hear. And I tried to drown it out, with more meetings, more projects, more pressure. But it wouldn't go away. It only grew louder because it demanded to be heard. One day I asked myself, who am I doing all this for? Who am I proving this to? Did I choose this life? Or did I just agree to it so everyone could see I'd made it? Suddenly, the life that once felt like a goal turned into a lifelong obligation that neither filled me nor brightened my mornings. You might think, but I earned it. Yes, maybe you did. But what if it still leaves you cold? What if it's not about arriving, but about the chase, and you discover that the chase alone doesn't nourish you? That it doesn't guarantee love, understanding, or community? I remember that turning point. A moment so unspectacular nobody noticed. I stood in my sleek home office, surrounded by growth charts, diplomas, awards, shelves full of proof that I'd made it. Yet I didn't feel accomplished. I felt empty. I felt alien in that room, in that role, in that supposed fulfillment. I realized success often happens on the surface. It changes things, but rarely moves what you truly are. So I began asking different questions. When was the last time I did something just for myself? Not because it was productive, but because it touched me. When did I last learn? Not to hit better numbers, but to grow. When did I last connect with someone? Just because, without any agenda? Those questions led me down other paths. They made me walk away from projects, deepen conversations, discover rituals no one sees. They showed me that people stay for your presence, not for your achievements. That love arrives when you're present, not impressive. And that life truly serves you when you feel it, not when you measure it. This wasn't a rejection of success, but a reorientation. I still want to grow, create, contribute, but no longer at any cost. No longer for the external image, but because it moves me. Not because it's loud, but because it resonates. That changes everything. I used to stare at a blank page in the morning with no enthusiasm. Now I write by candlelight because I want to honor a story, not a title. Recognition is welcome, but I no longer expect it. Because being recognized is not why I do what I do. I do it because I feel it, and that makes every day different, authentic and fulfilling, even without applause. If you realize that the success you chase leaves you untouched, hear it not as defeat, but as an invitation to reconnect with yourself, with what gives you life, beyond metrics, spotlights, and symbols. The success you can feel isn't the kind you show the world. It's the kind that brings you home to yourself. Chapter 17. The body grows tired, too, when you ignore it. We all live inside stories, concepts, and ideas, and yet so often neglect the living body that makes it all possible. We assume we are our thoughts, our plans, our constant doing, but that's only the surface. The body senses before we think. It doesn't complain loudly, but it leaves traces, intention, fatigue, small symptoms we ignore as long as we can, until one day we can't ignore them any longer. I lived that way too. For a long time I was on autopilot, eyes on the goal, hands on the wheel, senses turned off. I woke up, worked, and kept going as if only my mind directed everything. My body? Just a vehicle, steady, durable, endlessly available, until it wasn't. I first noticed it in little signals. Tense shoulders I chalked up to perfectionist posture. A dull ache in my lower back after sitting too long. A leaden heaviness in my legs, though I'd only been thinking. Instead of listening, I pressed on, gritted my teeth, told myself, it'll pass. But it never did. Eventually, a classic stress phase brought reality home. Not all at once, but like a constant grinding until my body and nervous system quietly but resolutely rebelled. Not dramatically, but meaningfully. Sleep became shallow. Concentration scattered. A perpetual, deep tiredness. I woke up knowing. It's no longer enough to choose my words more carefully. I have to feel this body again. Only when I went backward did the circle close. I began taking my body seriously, not as a servant, but as a partner. I realized it sends information about how we live, feel, and what our limits are. And most of that information we lose by ignoring it. I started small. I actually paused. No agenda, no routines, no to-dos. Just breath. Just silence. I noticed how my chest rose and fell. How pain didn't always mean danger, but often a signal to change. How tension reflected unspoken emotions. And slowly I relearned my postural habits. That tight shoulders often carry inner constriction. That back pain can express emotional burden. This wasn't about productivity. It was about purpose. I took up yoga, not for fitness, but out of curiosity. How does my body move when I'm not driven? How does it feel when I breathe? How does it respond when I simply pause? These questions pulled me out of my head and back into the living stream that flows through every fiber. If you ignore your body, You live at a distance from yourself. You sit in life, but you're not grounded. You make choices with your mind, but execute them by habit. You think you stand, but you're not rooted, and eventually you pay the price. I learned that self-care isn't a trend or a slogan. It's a survival principle. Otherwise, we misplace our patience until it's too late, until the body no longer whispers, but breaks down. Ignoring those signals is dangerous until you finally stop to listen. That doesn't guarantee immediate healing or stress relief, but awareness is a start. It starts when you feel that booking a physiotherapy session isn't about productivity, that an evening walk needs no goal, that a night screen-free doesn't waste time but creates space. You'll find that reconnecting with your body raises new questions and even restlessness, but it brings clarity. You may not become more flexible physically, but you become more supple inside. Not necessarily healthier, but more whole. Because not everything works. You feel it. And that is the core of being human. Your body isn't a machine. It's a landscape of stories, maps, and pathways. Imperfect, sentient, wise. Maybe the first step isn't to fix it, but to translate it. To listen again. To ask, what do you need right now? And then, how can I pay attention? When you truly hear yourself, you stop ignoring yourself. It isn't a luxury. It's life lived in full, not in fragments. Chapter 18. Freedom begins where you stop comparing yourself. Comparisons are silent but constant. A glance at someone else's clicks, a story, a conversation, and you feel that subtle tug. You're not enough. Before you know it, you judge yourself by someone else's standards, while your own rhythm has gone missing. You keep running, thinking you're not there yet. But the track you're on was never meant for you. It starts innocently. You scroll social feeds, read resumes, hear of successes, and instead of feeling inspired, you feel a subtle tension. A pressure telling you, not strong enough, not successful enough, not celebrated enough, not happy enough. And from that springs all the things that block freedom. Doubt, self-criticism, a quiet competition that steals your breath. I know that. Weeks I believed I could catch up if I only looked away for a moment. That I'd become braver because I admired someone else's story. That I'd be freer by comparing. But I only grew smaller, more restless, more distant from what I'd once felt, my own measure. And that doesn't free you. It traps you in a web of expectations that aren't yours. You are more than your public image, more than a statistic, more than a role. You are a sum of moments, inner movements, personal values, irreplaceable feelings. True freedom starts with returning to that deepest self, where there's no leaderboard, only you. You truly begin to feel free when you realize your path doesn't run parallel to another's, that you aren't meant to function like they do, that you're not a copy, but an original. The moment you start, you shed the habit of measuring yourself. You see that every life has different fractures, impulses, and words. A real turning point for me came in the middle of a conversation about goals and achievements. I noticed I was diminishing myself because I craved affirmation that my path was worthwhile. Instead of my own clarity, I sought external approval. In that instant, I paused and felt how little I offered myself, how tightly I clung to a picture I thought I had to maintain. And then, softly but surely, came freedom. I let go. When you compare less, you hear more. You hear yourself. Your steps become clearer. Not loudly, not in protest, but in a quiet clarity that sustains you. You make room for what really matters: your process, your pace, your strengths, and your necessary pauses. Physically, I feel it. By quitting the comparison, I no longer run against myself. I stop to rest. I slow down. I go deeper. I sense moments more fully, beyond talk of output, beyond performance, beyond the need to be always on. They feel honest. They open space for care, dedication, joy that's not loud, but strong in its silence. At first, giving up comparison triggered guilt. You should be doing more to keep up. But then the questions shifted. Not, what do I have to accomplish to keep pace? But, how does it feel to stand on your own terms? That question wasn't a test. It was a gateway to vast new freedom. I discovered that the freedom from comparison leads to a different quality of achievement. One that springs from authenticity, in conversations, in creations, in character, regardless of visibility or resonance, and all the more powerful because it's rooted in your own depth. You won't become unproductive by stopping the comparisons. Instead, you stop contorting yourself to meet foreign ideals, and that breeds confidence. Not from applause or big numbers, but from the quiet knowing that you stand revealed by choice, not by someone else's script. As you move through your day, you'll hear two voices, one telling you how you should look or be, and the other inviting you to follow your own path. If you choose not to heed the first, that's where freedom begins. Freedom from what you never truly wanted, and freedom for what's waiting inside you. When you stop comparing, you don't slip into autopilot. You step into living color, depth, and personal resonance. Sometimes it takes stepping back from the noise, from benchmarks. A breath of silence to rediscover your melody. Then ask yourself, do I really need their trophy? Or is it enough that I feel my own song? Chapter 19. When you stop explaining yourself. In so many areas of life, you're programmed to explain yourself. As a child, you sought answers to be understood. Later, you learned to justify yourself, to belong, to avoid misunderstandings, to keep peace. And at some point, that readiness to explain becomes an invisible habit that costs energy, blocks closeness, and undermines real encounter. I lived that too. In family talks, business meetings, friendships. Everywhere I felt I was sharing my motives not out of conviction, but out of reflex. I had to make others understand who I am and what I think. You shape your words to be digestible, packaging your stance so it feels familiar. And while you talk, you notice no one's truly listening, because an explanation signals that something was hidden, provoking questions or judgments instead of genuine presence. One day, in a conversation with someone who could really listen, something unexpected happened. I opened my mouth and hardly spoke at all. Instead of an explanation, I heard silence, and I heard myself. Because I wasn't explaining, I was simply present. I felt the space shift, my friend relax, uncertain yet open. In that moment, I realized that between you and another person, no explanation should stand if you want real connection. Explanations build bridges, but often lead you past each other. When you hear, explain why you feel this way, you think, because it feels that way. But that feeling is hard to put into words. If you simply show up, with voice, breath, gaze, posture, you begin revealing yourself without contorting into an explanation. You show yourself, not a justification. I remember talking with a friend and sensing that my urge to explain outweighed my desire to truly connect. When I realized that, I stopped talking, took a deep breath, and said, "This is what I feel right now. I can't explain more." That was enough. He didn't respond with follow-up questions, but with a gesture, with presence. He took me in as though I'd already arrived. No roadmap, no proof of understanding, just mutual presence. That changes you. You no longer feel you must prove yourself. You no longer believe your thoughts or background must be unpacked and translated to be accepted. You stand free because you reveal nothing behind words, only yourself. And that changes everything. When you stop explaining, space opens. For depth, for silence, for feelings to exist untranslated, uncontrolled, real. A space where closeness isn't manufactured by clarity, but experienced. Human encounter becomes simpler and more essential. You no longer say, "See, this is why," but embody your truth by simply being. Of course, this brings unease, because habits are strong, especially when everyone expects you to explain. Even your silence becomes weightier than your words. Yet it's a courageous move to remain quietly present and say, "I don't owe you an explanation." Some will be puzzled. Some will think you've withdrawn, when really you're more present than ever. And in that you open a new level of authenticity. Connection isn't built on knowledge, but on presence. And when you reclaim your presence, without explanation or defense, you change not only your relationships, but how you relate to yourself. You begin living as a self-standing presence, not an argument to be validated. Looking back, you'll see how much time you spent explaining instead of showing. How much energy you wasted proving yourself to listeners who only wanted you to be. And then you realize you set yourself free, not by words, but by omission. Not by explaining, but by simply being. In the end, you remain there, quietly but unmistakably. Not because you didn't exist before, but because you finally stopped translating yourself. You are. You stay. And that is enough in a world that rarely accepts you without explanation. Chapter 20. The day I began living for myself. Sometimes there comes a morning when you wake up and realize everything has changed, even though nothing around you has. You haven't taken a dramatic step, no spectacle, no loud, "Today my new life begins" consciousness. Instead, you feel in that exact moment when your eyes open that something inside you has grown clearer. Something tells you this day isn't just another ordinary day, but the starting line. The day you choose to put yourself first. I remember such a morning. I awoke half asleep and suddenly felt no twinge in my stomach. No old unrest, no pressure to perform. Just a calm knowing that today I would do something I owed myself. No rousing resolutions, no bullet-pointed plan, no crown of to-dos. It was more like a deep breath spreading through me. And in that instant, I knew I am ready to stop aligning my life with others' expectations and start aligning it with what truly moves me. It isn't a conscious plan, not because I doubted everything, but because I realized each choice after that would be a small return to myself. I stopped scheduling around my social circle's ideal. I began reserving time for me, not as an afterthought, but as a prerequisite. I said no to what didn't enrich me and gave myself permission to say yes to what made me feel alive, without hurry, without justification, but with deep resolve. When you start living for yourself, the ordinary transforms. Your morning coffee becomes not routine, but a ritual in which you consciously tune into yourself. An afternoon meeting becomes not an obligation, but the question, do I want to be here? Every moment is measured not by outcome, but by presence, whether you are there, feeling, fully alive. That day is a quiet manifesto. No theatrics, no grand exit. Instead, it's a still yet unwavering declaration. Because you begin taking personal responsibility for your time, your pauses, your space. You stop being an instrument of others' agendas, even if they claim self-improvement. You stop optimizing yourself for others and begin sensing yourself. Every deliberate step echoes your inner compass, rendering everything else secondary. I changed my language, not through courses but through gradual awareness. Questions like, do I really want this now? And does this nourish me? Became my tools. My no ceased to fracture and instead clarified. My yes wasn't compliance, but responsibility to myself. My day became a map of my own will. Not because I sought more accomplishment, but because I had begun living with feeling. That day wasn't a final chapter. It was the first chapter of the real book, my life. From then on, nothing was irrational, even if it defied expectations. Nothing was wasteful, even if it appeared unproductive, because I didn't strive for external goals any longer. I acted for myself, and that felt more intense than any external measure. I wish everyone could experience that morning, not as an event, but as a choice. Not as a slogan, but as living reality. And somehow the moment you hear these words, it's that very instant. Whether you embrace it now or years from now, that day isn't tomorrow's beginning. It's this moment, when you claim what truly belongs to you. Your life, lived fully, consciously, and in resonance with yourself. Thank you for listening all the way through. If this audiobook touched you, stirred you, or made you think, please share your thoughts in the comments. I read them all. And if you'd like more honest, direct, and up-close content, subscribe to the channel. We'll meet again in the next chapter of your journey, one you now consciously choose to live for yourself.